of salvation. The air around them was thick with tension. Every breath the three soldiers took felt like it could be their last. Elena, Captain Knox and Captain Harris stood frozen, their backs against the rocky outcrop, staring into the glowing eyes of the creatures that surrounded them. They were outnumbered, overpowered, and every possible escape route was blocked. The creatures moved in closer, their twisted wooden forms creaking and groaning as they extended their gnarled limbs toward the soldiers. The fear in Elena's heart was palpable, and she could feel Sonia and Harris tense beside her. This was it, their last stand. Then suddenly, a piercing howl cut through the night air, freezing both the soldiers and the creatures in place. The ground trembled beneath them, and from the darkness of the forest, two massive figures emerged. Their glowing yellow eyes cut through the shadows, and their hulking forms seemed to blur as they charged toward the creatures. The first, larger of the two, was a terrifying male werewolf, standing easily over 7 feet tall, its black fur matted and gleaming in the dim light. His muscular frame rippled with power, each step thudding against the ground like thunder. His claws, long and razor-sharp, gleamed in the moonlight as he snarled, baring his fangs. Beside him, the smaller figure was a female werewolf, her silver-grey fur sleek and shimmering. Though smaller than her companion, her presence was no less fearsome, her glowing eyes filled with a deadly focus. The male werewolf didn't hesitate. With a savage roar, he leapt into the fray, his claws cutting through the twisted creatures like a knife through butter. He moved with an animalistic grace, his strength unmatched by anything the soldiers had ever seen. The creatures stood no chance as the werewolf ripped through their ranks, sending splinters of wood and bark flying in all directions. His claws dug deep into their wooden forms, tearing them apart with sheer brute force. Meanwhile, the female werewolf turned towards the three soldiers, her yellow eyes locked onto them, and with a guttural growl, she began to shift. Her fur rippled and her bones cracked as her body twisted and contorted. The transformation was brutal and agonizing, her wolf-like form shrinking down until, after a few painful seconds, a woman stood before them, panting. The woman, now fully human, smiled through the pain. "Hey," she said, her voice surprisingly casual when given the chaos around them. "Hey, I'm Elara. Let Lucas slow those things down while I get you out of here." Elena, Sonia, and Harris stared at her, wide-eyed, then at each other. "The dream," Sonia whispered, disbelief colouring her tone. Elara didn't seem to notice their shock. She turned to check on Lucas, who was still tearing through the creatures, his claws slicing through them with ease. But even with his ferocity, the strange being seemed unaffected by his attacks. While his claws could tear chunks from their wooden bodies, it wasn't enough. The creatures simply reformed, their gnarled shapes repairing themselves as they continued to close in on him. They couldn't match Lucas's speed and strength, but wood and bark didn't bleed. They didn't weaken. Elena finally found her voice. What are you?" Elara, still catching her breath from the transformation, shot her a glance. "I'll explain later. Right now we need to move. If we stay, we're all dead." The three soldiers hesitated for only a moment, but the sight of Lucas continuing to battle the creatures pushed them into action. They knew Elara was their only chance. Nodding, they followed her lead, sprinting through the dense forest as Lucas stayed behind, keeping the creatures at bay. The forest blurred around them, the sound of Lucas's roars and the creatures' relentless groans fading into the background as they ran. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, her mind still struggling to process what she had just seen. Werewolves. Real, living werewolves. And they were fighting on their side. "Lucas!" Elara suddenly shouted over her shoulder, her voice sharp and commanding. "Time to go." From somewhere behind them, there was a final, thunderous roar, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. In an instant, Lucas was beside them, his massive wolf form leaping over fallen logs and rocks with effortless grace. He snarled as he glanced back at the creatures, which were still advancing, their wooden bodies bearing deep claw marks, but no real damage. "We're not safe yet," Elara said, her voice breathless but firm. "Those things won't stop, but Lucas bought us time." The three soldiers looked back in horror as the creatures regrouped. Though battered and torn, they were relentless, their eyes still locked on their prey. Elena's mind raced. How could they defeat something that didn't bleed, didn't break? And more importantly, what were these creatures, and why were they here? As they reached the clearing, the fear in their hearts only grew. There were no answers, only more questions. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The group finally came to a stop after what felt like hours of running. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they settled in a small clearing deep within the forest. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Lucas, still in his hulking werewolf form, stood guard a few yards away, his glowing eyes scanning the tree line, muscles tense, ready for another fight. Sonia sat down on a fallen log, wiping sweat from her brow, and glanced over at Elara. "So, what's your story?" she asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the group. Elara leaned against a tree, catching her breath. Her silver hair fell loosely around her shoulders, still slightly dishevelled from her recent transformation. She shrugged. "We got a message from the man. We were the closest ones, and we've been tracking these disturbances for weeks." "Who's the man?" Anthony asked, crossing his arms. Elara sighed, her gaze distant for a moment before she spoke. "Winter. He's busy with another dimensional being, something far worse than what we're dealing with. He asked us to handle this." "Winter," Elena repeated, her mind racing. "So it's all real? Werewolves, vampires. The guy with the chrome mask." Elara gave a small apologetic smile. "It is. And your chrome mask guy? That's Winter. He's the one who saved all of us. Saved this world from something terrible." Sonia, her brow furrowed, exchanged a glance with Elena. "We've seen him in our dreams," she said, her voice soft. "Every night. We're trapped, fighting in an apocalypse, and he's always there." Elara nodded. "You're seeing what could have come to pass if Winter hadn't intervened. Those dreams, they're glimpses of the darkest timeline, one where everything fell apart, but you're still connected to him, probably because of what's happening now." Anthony shifted uncomfortably, leaning forward. "So, these creatures we're dealing with, what's their weakness? How do we stop them?" Elara frowned, looking down at the ground. "That's the problem. We don't know. They're not like anything we've fought before. They're not vampires, not demons. They're something else, born from the fractures in reality. We need to find a weakness." Anthony stood, his face hard. "Just burn them. They're wood, right? Incinerate them until there's nothing left." "That's all well and good," Sonia added. "But how do we do that? What about that XL-18 you mentioned earlier?" Harris, leaning against a tree, shook his head. "That thing will burn anything in its path. No problem. But it's at the base, and that's a 6-hour drive from here." Elara smirked. "If only we had an elder. They can move through the shadows in seconds. They could fetch it for us." Before anyone could respond, Lucas let out a deep, guttural roar from the edge of the clearing, his massive body tensing as he crouched low, ready to pounce. Elara's eyes narrowed, and she sighed heavily. "They're coming," she said, her voice grim. "Excuse me." She stepped away from the group, her body already beginning to contort as she shifted back into her werewolf form. Bones cracked, and she screamed in pain as her muscles bulged and fur spread across her skin. The transformation was brutal and fast, but Elara remained focused, determined. Once fully shifted, she howled, a long, eerie sound that reverberated through the forest. It wasn't just any howl, it was almost a signal, a call for something, for someone. Then she shifted back into her human form, collapsing to her knees for a moment, her breath ragged. "Damn, that hurts," Elara muttered, rubbing her temples as she pushed herself to her feet. "Now let's move." Without further hesitation, the group started running again, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the creatures. Lucas led the way, his massive form moving effortlessly through the trees, while Elara stayed close to the others, her senses sharp. The night pressed in around them, the forest a maze of shadows and unseen dangers, but even as they ran, the weight of what Elara had revealed settled in their minds. Winter, the chrome mask, the glimpses of a shattered world they saw in their dreams. And now, these creatures, twisted things born from the very fabric of reality itself, chasing them through the night. They didn't have much time. Whatever Elara had summoned with her howl, they could only hope it would come soon. The group finally slowed, gasping for breath, as they reached a small clearing far from the pursuing creatures. The night had deepened, but the oppressive tension from before seemed to ease as they realized they had put enough distance between themselves and the monstrosities. For now, at least, they were safe. Lucas, still in his hulking werewolf form, let out a low growl as his body began to change back. His bones cracked and shifted painfully, his fur receding as he slowly transformed into his human form. The process wasn't smooth, and just as he nearly finished, his body convulsed, forcing him back into his werewolf form, then once again into human shape. He collapsed to his knees, panting and rubbing his temples. "Damn, that hurts," Lucas muttered, standing up and stretching his stiff limbs. "Hey all, I'm Lucas. Sorry I'm not as good at this whole changing on command thing as Elara. I'm still working on mastering it by my own will." He flashed them a grin, though exhaustion still clung to his features. "Anyway, glad you're all okay. Heard your friends are the man. Nice." Captain Harris gave him a nod, still trying to make sense of everything. Before anyone could respond, Lucas turned to Elara, his tone more serious. "You called one?" Elara's expression was unreadable as she nodded. "Yes." "Think they'll come?" Lucas asked, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Elara hesitated for a moment before replying, "Not sure this time." Elena, her curiosity piqued, stepped forward. "Who did you call?" "I called for an elder," Elara said, noticing the confusion on the soldiers' faces. She sighed and elaborated. "A vampire elder. They can retrieve this weapon of yours, the XL-18, in seconds. If they come, that is." Sonia raised an eyebrow, still catching her breath. "And why wouldn't they?" Elara gave a small, bitter smile. "Some of them don't really like us. You see, werewolves and vampires don't exactly have the friendliest history." Captain Knox, Elena and Harris exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen their share of combat, but this was a different kind of battle. Werewolves, vampires, creatures of twisted wood. This was beyond anything they had been trained for. Harris shook his head, still trying to process it all. "This is insane. I'm used to fighting humans, not whatever the hell these things are." Sonia nodded, her expression grim. "It's a lot to take in, but we faced worse odds. I don't care what these things are. We'll fight." "Agreed," Elena added, her voice steady. "We're ready." The three soldiers stood resolute, prepared for whatever came next. shift to a dark place. In a distant, shadowy corner of the world, an elder stirred. The vampire's back was to the view, shrouded in darkness, their face concealed by the deep shadows of their surroundings, but they had heard the call. Elara's howl reverberated through the walls of reality, like a ripple reaching into the depths of the supernatural world. The elder's lips twisted into a knowing smile. Slowly they rose from their seat, the darkness around them thickening as they stepped into it. Their form faded into the shadows, shifting through the inky blackness like a wraith. Back with Lucas, Elara, and the soldiers. Elara leaned back against a tree, her gaze drifting toward the treetops as she spoke. So, tell me what you know about those things, how they came to be. Elena took a breath and recounted the story of Woody, the strange log they'd found by the cabin, how it had seemed harmless at first, but turned into a monstrous, ever-growing horde of twisted creatures. Elara frowned as she listened. Something's behind this. Things like that don't just sprout out of nowhere. There's a force at play. Lucas stood alert, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. His voice broke the uneasy silence. Okay, I think they found us. The tension spiked as Lucas turned to the group. Ladies, it's time. With a grunt, Lucas dropped to his knees, his body rippling with muscle as he transformed once more into his massive werewolf form. The process was quicker this time, the pain evident but controlled. His claws dug into the earth, his eyes glowing with primal energy. Sonia turned to Elara, raising an eyebrow. Is he your man? Elara smiled softly, her eyes fond as she glanced at Lucas. Yes, we've been through so much together. With that, Elara's body contorted once again as she shifted into her wolf form, a powerful, sleek figure of silver fur. They both let out a deep, guttural growl, their focus now entirely on the approaching creatures. With a savage roar, Lucas lunged forward, claws flashing as he tore into the advancing monsters. Elara followed closely, her movements quick and precise, their teamwork seamless. But the creatures, now numbering in the dozens, poured forward relentlessly, their wooden forms regenerating as fast as Lucas and Elara could tear them apart. The forest became a battleground, filled with the sounds of growls, claws ripping through wood, and the creatures' eerie groans. Just as the battle raged on, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing with a slow, deliberate grace. The soldiers froze, their instincts screaming at them that this new presence was not a friend. I know you, a voice echoed through the clearing. The tone was female, silky smooth and laced with a cold, dark malice. The figure stood at the edge of the chaos, watching Lucas and Elara fight the creatures. A sinister smile curled on her lips. Not so tough now, are we, you mangy mutts? Elena, Sonia and Harris turned, instantly recognizing what this new figure was, an elder vampire. Her presence was oppressive, like the very air around her had darkened, filled with an unnatural chill. Unlike Lucas and Elara, this creature didn't radiate the same sense of loyalty or protection. She felt like death itself, her power ancient and overwhelming. So, the elder vampire purred, her gaze shifting to the soldiers. How can I help you? Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only danger. The elder vampire stood before the group, her sharp eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating smile. "Well," she said, her voice silky smooth. Captain Harris, still unsettled by her presence, but focused on the mission, cleared his throat. "There's a weapon we need. It's back at the base, but it's a 6-hour drive just to get there. We can't fight these things without it." The elder's smile widened, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "A weapon, you say? And here I thought you'd need something a bit more creative." She stepped closer to Harris, her presence suffocating. "Give me the details, my dear." Harris hesitated, then quickly gave her the specifics of the XL-18 flamethrower. "Consider it done," the vampire purred. Then, without another word, she dissolved into the shadows, vanishing before their eyes. The sudden silence was jarring, and the tension among the group lifted just slightly. Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "That was strange. I wasn't sure if she was about to eat us or actually help." Sonia nodded, her hand still on the hilt of her gun. "I don't trust her, but if she can get us that flamethrower, we'll need it." The group's attention shifted to the battle raging nearby. Lucas and Elara were a whirlwind of fury, tearing through the twisted creatures with a precision and power that only lichens possessed. They moved together effortlessly, dodging and slashing, their claws ripping through the wooden abominations. But something was wrong. As they cut down one of the creatures, it simply reformed, the splintered wood knitting itself back together within moments. Lucas and Elara exchanged a glance, realizing that their strength alone wouldn't be enough. No matter how many they took down, the creatures just rose again, as relentless as ever. Elara was the first to retreat, her silver fur shimmering as she bolted back toward the group. She shifted mid-sprint, her body convulsing as she transformed back into her human form. She stumbled slightly, exhausted from the repeated changes. "Anything?" Elara asked, her voice breathless, eyes darting to the others. Sonia glanced at Harris, then back to Elara. "Yeah, some vampire woman showed up. Scared the hell out of me." Elara's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh, crap. Seranna." "Who's Seranna?" Elena asked, tension thick in her voice. Elara frowned. "She's one of the worst. Powerful. Extremely cunning. We've had our run-ins with her before, but we're all supposed to be working together now. Still, if she's involved, we need to be careful." A voice suddenly cut through the tension. "You missed me, darling." Seranna stepped out from the shadows, her elegant form materializing with unnatural grace. She held the XL-18 flamethrower casually in one hand, as if the heavy weapon were a mere trinket. Her dark eyes glinted with amusement as she handed the weapon to Harris. "Boys and their toys," she teased, her smile curling wickedly. "Maybe when this is all over, we can play for a while, Captain." Her eyes lingered on him, and her lips curled into a smile that dripped with dangerous allure. Harris shifted uncomfortably, but took the flamethrower from her without hesitation, strapping it to his back. "Seranna," Elara said, her voice tense. "It's been a while." Seranna turned her attention to Elara, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two women locked eyes, tension crackling between them like an unspoken history. But the vampire said nothing in return. She shifted her gaze back to Harris. Her interest in Elara seemingly vanished. "Well," Seranna purred, "if I'm no longer needed, I'll take my leave. These things make me uncomfortable." Her gaze flicked toward Lucas, still in his werewolf form, with a mix of disdain and amusement. "Not so tough now, are we?" Without waiting for a response, Seranna's form dissolved back into the shadows, her presence vanishing as swiftly as it had come. "Good riddance," Elara muttered under her breath, her eyes watching the shadows carefully. Captain Harris, finally ready for the fight ahead, strapped the XL-18 flamethrower onto his back with a satisfied grin. "Now we're talking," he said, his fingers running over the weapon's controls. The deadly instrument of firepower hummed in his hands, ready to unleash destruction. Sonia smirked. "Let's burn them to ash." The three soldiers exchanged looks, their resolve hardening. Elara and Lucas prepared themselves, now fully understanding the stakes. The creatures that had been nearly unstoppable moments ago were now about to face a fire they couldn't recover from. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Harris gripped the XL-18 flamethrower tightly, his eyes locked on the advancing creatures. Sonia and Elena stood by his side, their weapons ready, but it was clear that this time the real power lay in the flamethrower strapped to Harris's back. The XL-18 was designed for heavy-duty work, originally meant for clearing thick foliage and overgrown landscapes, but tonight it was going to be put to a much darker use. "Ready?" Harris asked, glancing at Sonia and Elena, his face set in determination. "Let's light them up," Sonia replied, her voice steady as she readied her own weapon. Harris triggered the XL-18, and with a thunderous roar, a jet of bright orange fire erupted from the nozzle, engulfing the nearest creature in an instant. The flames consumed it whole, reducing its twisted wooden form to ash in seconds. There was no chance for it to regenerate this time. The fire burned too hot, too fast. The creature's eerie glowing eyes flickered and died as its body disintegrated into nothing. Harris swung the flamethrower around, the stream of fire sweeping across the forest floor. More creatures came forward, their grotesque forms stumbling through the trees, but they didn't stand a chance. One by one they were incinerated, their limbs igniting like dry kindling, the flames crackling and snapping in the night air. "Damn," Harris muttered, gritting his teeth as he unleashed another torrent of flames. "This thing certainly does its job." Elena watched in awe as the XL-18's firepower turned the creatures into piles of smoking ash. "It's like burning weeds," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Exactly," Harris replied, keeping his focus. "It's designed for clearing foliage, but it's more than enough to clear these things." The creatures, once relentless in their pursuit, were now nothing more than charred remains scattered across the ground. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and smoke, the once vibrant forest now littered with ash and embers. The fire raged, but as Harris burned through the last of the creatures, an eerie silence fell over the clearing. They stood there for a moment, breathing heavily as the smoke drifted around them. "Is that all of them?" Elena asked, her eyes scanning the ash-covered ground. Sonia kicked at a pile of smouldering remains with her boot. "Seems like it. Nothing left to regenerate." The tension eased slightly as the realization hit them. Those twisted things, the ones that had seemed invincible, were finally gone. Elara, still in her human form, approached the group, her face grim but relieved. "Good work, but we're not done yet. Let's head back to that cottage of yours, see if we can dig up anything useful." Sonia nodded. "Yeah, I want my gun bag." Captain Harris grinned, patting the flamethrower. "I've got a couple of guns in the truck too. Might come in handy." Lucas, still in his werewolf form but standing tall and alert, turned towards the woods. Together, the group made their way back through the woods, the forest now much quieter than before. There was an eerie calm in the air, as if the creature's destruction had brought a strange peace to the once chaotic night. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows as they moved swiftly but cautiously towards the cottage. As they approached, the sight of the cottage, or what remained of it, greeted them. The small structure had been reduced to nothing more than a charred ruin. The walls had collapsed in on themselves, and the roof was gone, leaving behind only smouldering embers and blackened debris. Sonia's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the destruction. Well, there goes the cottage. Elena shook her head. Whatever we find here, it's going to be buried under ash. Lucas shifted back into his human form, his breathing laboured as he leaned against a tree. We'll have to search through the wreckage. There might be something important in there. Something that could explain all of this. Elara glanced at the destroyed cottage, her eyes dark and thoughtful. These things didn't just come out of nowhere. We need to figure out who... She paused, correcting herself. Or what is behind this? Captain Harris, now with the flamethrower strapped to his back, like a soldier preparing for the next battle, nodded. We'll find answers. Let's start digging. As they stood before the ruins of the cottage, the smoke rising into the cold night air, they knew the battle wasn't over. The creatures were gone, but the mystery behind them, the force that had set this nightmare into motion, still lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike again. The air around the charred remains of the cottage was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burnt wood. The group, Elena, Sonia, Captain Harris, Lucas and Elara, stood among the ruins, searching for any clue, any sign of what had started this nightmare. But as they sifted through the ashes, overturned debris, and blackened remnants of what had once been their safe haven, it became clear that there was nothing to find. Nothing, Sonia muttered, frustration lacing her voice as she kicked at a piece of burnt furniture. How does something like this happen? And why here? Elena frowned, brushing soot from her hands. It doesn't make sense. There's got to be a reason behind all of this. Someone or something is pulling the strings. Captain Harris scanned the ruins, his mind racing. This kind of power, these creatures, it's beyond anything we've faced. Lucas, now back in his human form, leaned against a half-burnt tree, arms crossed over his chest, his brow furrowed in thought, before he finally spoke. We can't call Winter in. If we do, he'll think we're useless. Elara, standing nearby, glanced at Lucas with a knowing smile. He probably already knows what's happening here. If it was truly beyond us, Winter would have come himself, or at least sent one of the big guys. Lucas smirked. Fair point. Elara's eyes narrowed as a thought crossed her mind. Let me try something. Without waiting for a response, she shifted once again into her werewolf form, her bones cracking and reshaping painfully, fur sprouting from her skin as her body elongated. The soldiers watched in confusion as Elara, now fully transformed, began to sniff the air, her senses heightened. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the dying embers from the burnt cottage. Elena, Sonia and Harris exchanged uncertain glances, the silence thick with tension. Then, suddenly, Elara stopped and let out a low growl. She snorted, her nose twitching as she picked up a scent. Something faint, but unmistakable. Her head snapped toward Lucas, and he grinned as if they had shared a silent communication. We've got something, Lucas said, his voice filled with purpose. He turned to the others, his expression serious. We're going to need you three to stay here and hold point. Me and Elara are going to check this out. Whatever it is, it's supernatural. We'll move faster without you, and you'll be safer here. Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Lucas cut her off. If anything happens, fire a couple of rounds into the air. We'll hear it. Reluctantly, the soldiers nodded. Lucas and Elara's expertise in the supernatural realm was clear, and they had to trust them. With that, Lucas gave a final nod before he shifted back into his werewolf form, the transformation as painful as ever. He let out a low growl, and Elara, already in her werewolf state, growled in response. Together, the two lichens sprinted off into the woods, their powerful legs carrying them effortlessly through the thick underbrush. The soldiers watched as the pair disappeared into the shadows of the forest, their speed inhuman, their forms quickly vanishing into the darkness, deep in the woods. Lucas and Elara ran side by side, their movements synchronized, their senses heightened as they sped through the forest. The trees blurred around them, the wind whipping through their fur as they moved with supernatural grace and speed. Their powerful muscles propelled them over fallen logs, through dense thickets, and across rocky terrain, their noses guiding them towards something unnatural. After what felt like miles, they finally slowed, their glowing eyes catching sight of a strange structure hidden deep within the woods. An old church, crumbling and forgotten, stood in the middle of nowhere. Its stone walls were covered in moss, and vines twisted around the decaying architecture like fingers gripping the building, refusing to let go. The windows were shattered, and the once grand steeple was cracked and leaning. It looked as though it hadn't been touched by human hands in centuries. Elara growled softly, her sharp eyes scanning the area. Together, they approached the ancient structure, their senses on high alert as the darkness seemed to thicken around them. Something was waiting for them inside, something ancient and dangerous. Lucas and Elara entered the decaying church with silent caution, their eyes scanning the darkened corners of the ancient structure. As soon as they stepped through the door, a wave of overwhelming pain surged through their bodies. They fell to their knees, writhing in agony as their bones cracked and twisted. Both lichens were forced to revert to their human forms, their powerful werewolf strength vanishing in an instant. Lucas lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling from the pain. "Something forced me back," he whispered, his voice strained. Elara groaned beside him, her face twisted in pain. A dark, eerie laugh echoed through the hollow church, cutting through the air like a knife. It was a sound both Lucas and Elara recognized immediately. "I know that laugh," Lucas said, his voice filled with dread. Elara's eyes widened in disbelief as she struggled to sit up. "It can't be." Back at the cottage. Hours passed as Elena, Sonia and Captain Harris waited for word from Lucas and Elara. The once bustling forest had fallen into a strange silence, and the three friends couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. Sonia leaned against a tree, her arms crossed, her face thoughtful. "We keep hearing about this Winter guy, but who is he? Really?" Elena nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "In the dreams, he's the most dominant of all things. Even though he's just human, he's in control. He's always there, and there's something about him, like he sees every possible outcome, like he's 10 steps ahead of everything." Captain Harris chimed in, his voice steady. "I've always said the human mind is the most powerful weapon of all things. It can put rockets into space, create things like the internet and computers. Hell, the mind can shape the entire world. All we need is one mind that's evolved beyond its years, and it would truly be the most powerful thing." Sonia looked intrigued. "So, you think Winter is just smarter than everyone?" "More than that," Harris replied. "He's beyond us. If you have a mind that can outthink every move a vampire or werewolf makes, you don't need strength or fangs to win. The power of thought is unmatched." They continued to speculate, talking in circles, trying to unravel the mystery of Winter. As the day passed into night, the forest remained quiet, and there was still no sign of Lucas or Elara. Anxiety gnawed at them, each passing hour feeding into the tension. Eventually, they took turns keeping watch. When it was Elena's turn to rest, she drifted off, but her sleep was anything but peaceful. Suddenly, she bolted upright, her eyes wide with shock. "He spoke to me," she whispered, her voice urgent. Sonia and Harris rushed over, concern etched on their faces. "Who?" Sonia asked. "Winter," Elena replied, her voice trembling. "He didn't speak in words. It was like I just knew. And I know this now. Lucas and Elara are in trouble. We have to help them." Captain Harris's expression hardened, his decision made. They saved us back there. Now it's time to return the favour. He grabbed his gear and stood, his presence commanding. "Gear up," he ordered, his voice resolute. "Knox, you take point. I'll take the rear." As they readied themselves, Captain Harris approached Elena with a weapon in hand. He held out a sniper rifle, the metal gleaming in the moonlight. "I had this in the truck. There's no one better than you with it." Elena smiled, the weight of the situation not lost on her. She took the rifle, her fingers curling around the familiar grip. As she looked up, she quoted softly, "And behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death." And hell followed with her. The three friends exchanged determined glances, ready for whatever lay ahead. Their path was clear. Lucas and Elara needed them, and they weren't going to let them face this alone.